Interim Executive Director of the Education Quality Outcome Standards, or EQOS for short. Welcome to our session, Outcomes and JFF, the story behind an acquisition. A little background for anyone who may be unfamiliar with JFF and our work. We're an almost 40-year-old national nonprofit working at the intersection of workforce and education, policy and practice. You can learn more at jff.org. As the title of the session suggests, JFF acquired EQOS in late January of this year as part of our broader strategy to drive insights around quality and efficacy throughout the workforce and education ecosystem. Briefly, EQOS is a nonprofit organization that establishes universal, independent measures of education and training program quality to help people navigate the increasingly crowded and confusing education and training marketplace. Today, my colleague Gabriel Ben-Yaakov and I are hosting a rebroadcast of a recent conversation between myself and two EQOS board members, Michael Horn, Senior Strategist at Guild Education and award-winning author, and Tameshia Bridges Mansfield, Vice President for Workforce Innovation at JFF. Michael, Tameshia, and I discussed the need for better methodologies, tools, and policies to support evaluating and defining the quality across a wide range of post-secondary education and training models. I want to thank Michael for hosting this discussion on his Future of Education podcast series. If you're not familiar with Michael's interviews on a wide range of education topics, you can check them all out on YouTube, and we'll drop the link in the chat for you all. Gabriel, would you like to introduce yourself quickly?
Yes, and thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Gabriel Ben-Yaakov, but feel free to call me Gab. That's what everyone calls me. I'm the manager of strategy and communications for EQOS, and I've been on the EQOS team for almost 2 years, and I've seen it grow from a small startup to JFF's newest acquisition. So it's been a really, really exciting journey. Since joining EQOS, I've worked to develop our strategic vision, build our partnerships and client relationships, and manage our work with states, particularly around our state pilot program, which I'll be happy to discuss in greater detail after the broadcast. Please be sure to drop your questions into the chat throughout the broadcast, and Steve and I will answer your questions in the last 20 minutes or so of the session. And with that, enjoy the discussion, and we will see you all again here soon.
Welcome to the Future of Education. I'm Michael Horn, particularly excited about today's show because it gets to talk about a passion project of mine, quality outcomes and assuring that we actually know the real data for how learners are doing in their post-secondary programs with an organization that I helped co-found and serve on the board of that was recently acquired by Jobs for the Future, or JFF. And to talk through EQOS and JFF and this new partnership, tremendously excited to welcome to the show today Steve Yadzinski, who's the Senior Innovation Officer at JFF and is currently helping manage the transition and integration of EQOS into JFF and really working to expand EQOS's partnerships and develop sustainable models for the organization that will really have far-reaching impact on learning and workforce systems. And we'll talk more about what that means and how EQOS operates in a moment. And then also excited to welcome Tameshia Bridges Mansfield, who's the Vice President for Workforce Innovation at JFF, and most recently joining me as a member of the board at EQOS. At JFF, she oversees the workforce development and future of work initiatives, particularly around innovation and systems transformation. So I think this is going to be basically just the two right people to have at JFF to have this conversation. With that, I'll bring them to the metaphorical or virtual stage, whatever we're calling it these days in COVID. But Steve, Tameshia, it's good to see you both. Tameshia, let me start with you because I gave a very high level of what EQOS is focused on outcomes. But let's start with the why, and then we can get into the brass tacks a little bit more. Like, why is JFF interested in EQOS? What brought you to this conversation in the first place?
No, I think that's a really good starting point, and it's great to meet you, Michael. I'm looking forward to working with you. So really, I think the why is like the question that folks are kind of noodling in their heads right now. It's really about JFF really wanting to put a flag down and really looking to be a more powerful catalyst for change rather than merely just a conduit for change, right? And so with this perspective shift, it's really forced us to kind of take a look at, to re-examine what our our big picture and organizational strategy is, and really think about how we can drive innovation and impact in the education and workforce system. So, here comes EQOS, and we took a look at it and really came to see that in the 2 years that it has really developed a robust framework to really measure program quality and impact through outcomes, as well as really helping to build a respected platform for thought leadership. So it allows us to have some credibility as we talk about the importance of quality in the training and workforce ecosystem. And so with EQOS on board, we really see it as a way for JFF to strengthen our advisory services and practices with states, with higher education networks, with workforce systems, and really pursue a research agenda that is really grounded in quality and outcomes of career pathways with really increased clarity and focus, where we're not trying to name and define things, but we have something that we know works. And so really by combining forces with EQOS, it will really allow us to really extend our current work, both JFF's current work and EQOS's current work, and impact to more sectors and more communities, hopefully across the country.
Makes total sense. Steve, do you want to add anything to that since you've been riding shotgun to all these conversations?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great overview of sort of what we're up to with EQOS. The thing to mention is we've been partnered with EQOS for some time at JFF through a data initiative. We've also been working to evaluate and create catalogs of quality providers on a regional basis. EQOS has been the foundation of that vetting process and so forth. So we've really been, built a familiarity with the team, with the framework itself, and we're excited to bring it here into the family of JFF so that we can grow its capabilities.
So that starts us grounding, I think, with why JFF cared and got excited about EQOS, and vice versa, frankly, from the perspective of board and founding member, why we got excited about the partnership with JFF as well. But let's broaden the lens a little bit. Tameshia, I'd love to hear, why should the field pay attention to this? Why is this important more broadly as we think about impact and this transformation that you all at JFF really want to lean in on and shape in an active way?
Yeah, no, I think probably the first place to start with answering that is really just saying that we're right now going into what is a third year of a pandemic economy and labor market. And I think as we begin to look forward and really begin to work towards an equitable recovery, the field really has to take a closer look at the outcomes that are being produced by the training and workforce and education system. I think we're at a point where we can't just blindly say any training is good training, and we really have to take a closer look. And so I think because of that, the learning and workforce ecosystem is really reaching a turning point. And also, I would add that this marketplace is really large and has become really confusing and challenging for learners, for workers, for opportunity seekers, particularly folks who are from disadvantaged or marginalized community, to really make sense of it and to find the programs that are going to be right for them, that are going to meet their interests and needs, that are going to meet the demands of their local labor markets to really help them cultivate skills and find high-paying jobs. So it's really about being the field, being responsive to what people are asking for, what funders are asking for in terms of understanding quality. And so in many ways, I think EQOS is already rising and risen to that huge challenge through the quality assurance framework that really kind of drills down and looks at, well, what are 5 things that we would say count as quality? What for student learning? What is the learning outcomes? What are the completion outcomes? What does placement mean? How do earnings look? And really for workers, what does satisfaction look like of those training experiences? So you take all of that together, and I think it provides a really compelling message. I would also say that states are also getting curious and needing to know this as well as they begin to vet their learning offerings at the state level. And so it's really about meeting the needs of both learners and systems and bringing folks together to understand that. And so it's already kind of demonstrating the need that the field has for new and innovative training models. And I also think that program leaders and training leaders realize that they have to rise to the occasion now and are looking for easy mechanisms to be able to measure and understand their outcomes for themselves, right? To help tell their story of their own impact. And I think they need to do that with access to better data collection, more means of transparency, all of it that points the way for people. So what we really hope is that this acquisition really helps signal like JFF's intention to be more of service in more tangible ways in terms of moving progress forward as it relates to understanding the importance of outcomes for the field.
I feel like I'm like listening to all I had hoped EQOS would become listening to you. So I'm just like loving this and just to, double click on it. I think you talked about the different areas that we've created measurements for around learning, completion, placement, actual salary growth relative to investment and expected growth, so that we're not creating incentives to skim or cream, who you serve. But then also that last piece, the learner satisfaction. And then you also talked about how important it is for the institutions themselves to say, hey, this is the value we provide, and be able to customize it to what they would claim. I think both of those pieces are important, because my observation often from a lot of these conversations I have about quality and value in the post-secondary and workforce training spaces is that a lot of times we sort of thrust a definition onto an institution or an expectation of what we think the learner is trying to achieve. But in point of fact, they want something totally different from the experience that we don't have good ways of capturing. And so hopefully that customizability you spoke about will also help the field get more focused on what the learner's goals actually are in all this. But I think that's actually a good segue, because Steve, it allows you to maybe talk about, if those are the standards, what does EQOS actually do on the ground, and what does its work actually look like itself?
Yeah, it's a fabulous question. So EQOS work to date has been about partnering with state departments of higher education in New Jersey, Indiana as well, Colorado, and really advising partners in those states around best practices, how to aggregate data, how to build data systems. As a matter of fact, I just left a meeting with the New Jersey Department of Higher Education office that will be releasing a report that was built in partnership with EQOS at the end of the month, which details those recommendations. Moving forward, why did JFF bring EQOS here? We're really interested in furthering the practical utilization of this framework. We're really interested in pairing, as Tameshia was talking about, a research agenda with upgrades to the framework. So for example, we have our 5 elements of the framework. JFF is looking to build equity component to that. One of the key headings that we'll be looking at: how do we understand economic advancement, and what kinds of recommendations might we make to our partners around additional types of information that are important for learner success. So for example, access to financing options, access to career connection, how effective that is, access to other supports such as childcare or flexible scheduling and so forth. One of the things that is true with the pandemic coming into year 3 is that there are sort of permanent changes here that influence how we're working, but also how we're learning. And to meet those changes, a dynamic range of options are being built and launched, new credentials, and just the complexity of that alone. So being able to work around the framework itself, evolving how we define what is quality, what are some of those additional sort of more subjective components of offerings? How would people be able to use them to make the right choice for them moving forward, for example? The other thing to mention is that the EQOS framework, as I mentioned, it's the foundation of a vetting process that we've used to create a provider catalog for SkillUp, for example. There are other partners that are beginning to use that data. And so really being able to expand that, that data set so that we can understand some of those more dynamic nuances as people are evaluating the quality of programs as we progress here.
It's interesting hearing you say that, because you talked about the notion of evolving the standards also and keeping them up to date, but then also leveraging them in ways, or I guess also allow other providers to leverage them in ways to surface the right data at the right time to someone making a choice, basically, right? So that they can make a good choice, an informed choice for them. On one of my podcasts, Future You, we've had a lot of conversations lately about how a lot of the ranking systems and reports right now on ROI that have been coming out about college aren't terribly useful to an individual learner trying to make sense of where they ought to go, because it's not comparing, two schools that they might be comparing against each other, right? To each other. It's sort of looking at this in a very national way and not within particular labor markets or particular geographies and so forth. And so I think that segues where I want to go next to you, Tameshia, which is, let's dig in a little bit more about how JFF itself might use this quality assurance framework, because you said it will inform a lot of the work streams that you all have going on actively as well, and presumably this tighter coupling allows you to do some things that you wouldn't have otherwise been able to do.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And to your last point about how does EQOS help people make sense of what's happening in their local labor market? We really see EQOS really fitting seamlessly within our current work that we've been doing to develop a quality provider index, as Steve mentioned, to really evaluate the quality of learning providers, programs, and models at a local level. We were able to use that in the development of SkillUp, and EQOS, and working with EQOS prior to the acquisition, helped us to be able to understand and refine that. So I think it does provide an opportunity, once we get usage at scale at any local level, to be able to vet and understand the quality of providers in the context of what's happening on the ground in local communities. But then there's the question of well, how do you get the information to people? And so I would say the other thing that we're really interested in looking at and wanting to plan to dig into is really using the basis, or the framework, as a basis for new digital tools and infrastructure that will really help us to collect, to track, to analyze, which is great, but also to share, right, the insights that we're learning from what we're collecting about post-secondary quality data. Data is only as good as you make it accessible to people, to help people make sense of the world, to help stories and tell stories about what's happening. And so really figuring out what are the right tools to make the data and information that can come from the framework and that can be realized from the framework real for people and communities in real time. And then I would say also, as it relates to our advisory services, it's also kind of can be seen as a baseline of looking at a program or looking at a series of programs to say, how are they performing along these metrics, and then being able to provide services to help people raise their scores, improve their standing as it relates to the metrics that are there. So it's a way of thinking about how do we have our advisory services that are informed across a consistent definition of quality. So we're not having to recreate what quality means and looks like per provider, per their wishes, right? Or per what we think is relevant. But really we have a basis to begin and a level of expertise to start from that really helps inform any advice, recommendations, or implementation support that we would provide. So it's, in many ways, it's the data that we're hoping to kind of undergird that additional service and support that we provide to states, to workforce systems, and to communities in understanding what's happening.
When I hear you talk, Tameshia, it just reminds me how much JFF does across the landscape, right? Just how big the scope and remit is, and how many different sort of levers you have at your disposal, which I think is frankly really exciting. One of the things when we built the standards, and you mentioned it as well, it's to really provide the data and then let others figure out, okay, what's our threshold for, is this good or bad, and so forth. Steve, maybe turn to you on this question, because I want to go a level deeper on how you might see learners, leveraging this to navigate the post-secondary education and training marketplace. And I want to come at it with like a specific angle, which is, we know historically the most marginalized learners in our groups have been the least likely to consume some of the data that's out there to help them inform spaces. I think we've all offered some hypotheses already about why that is, the utility of the data and so forth. But how do you see what you all now have in EQOS as really helping change that dynamic and helping individuals navigate?
Yeah, I think there are a few ways. So the first thing to say is, you mentioned that there's a wide range of capabilities that JFF has. So our core competence of convening and thought leadership, as well as policy. So being able to advocate for those policies, those systems at the federal and state levels that aggregate information and make it available at scale, that helps people navigate and make those tough decisions, making it available to as many people as possible. So one piece is really around that convening and policy component. The other thing that we're really interested in is that practical use of some of these standards. So being able to draw the field together around a point of view around what quality looks like today as well as in the future. So being able to account for demand and being able to integrate that into some of the work is just one example of how we might be able to better indicate, this might be a better bet for an individual or versus another option. The other thing that I think is important to help people sort of navigate is really building our partnerships for those platforms that are using some of the standards. So we mentioned SkillUp. Guild is a partner who has used the framework to evaluate some of their partners. Climb Credit is a partner of ours. So a number of platforms can also integrate this, if you can think about sort of syndicating this to their own audiences above and beyond what JFF can do individually. So it's a bit about sort of a movement building, agreeing around the right measures, the right framework, building a sort of policy advocacy. What do we think should happen? What do we think can help this scale? And then also bringing partners together to advocate for the use, above and beyond JFF programming.
So I actually want to tee off on two things for both of you there. One piece you just mentioned is the ability for these standards to really exist outside of just the immediate JFF use case, if you will, right? And so in my contemplation, when we built the standards, we were also thinking, hey, this doesn't just have to apply to, say, workforce training providers. It could be your liberal arts college, right, that's trying to understand the value that they provide. Or right now, there's a ton of flack being given to arts programs that perhaps charge a fair amount of money and the outcomes are highly unclear. How do you all think about that as jobs for the future, focusing on the workforce and training element of this, but sort of the sense that maybe this could be the answer to help a lot of sectors of higher ed and post-secondary training and so forth better define the value that they're actually providing and what they're doing, and how will JFF support that, or maybe say, hey, great that you all want to run with this, it's yours. How do you all think about that, Steve?
Yeah, I'll start off, and Tameshia, please add on. One of the things we're thinking about in terms of further developing the framework is it's been used for sort of short-term credential programs to higher ed programs. And so it's been used on a wide range of programs. And we believe that over time we will want to sort of further specify that based on the particular audience or use case in some regard. So one thing to say on our roadmap is sort of regular releases or versions of the framework that are more appropriate for use in higher ed, short-term credentials, state systems, and so forth. So that's one thing to say. The other thing to say, by the way, I have an art background and I'm kind of proud of it, coming out of here. So I do have this sort of progressive set of experiences that bring me literally to this conversation today. and being able to help those institutions understand the value and the cross-transference of the skills that are gained in those programs, I think can be a really compelling sort of, research component. How do we define that? But also, how do we bring the partners together so that we can legitimately understand sort of the longitudinal, things that could take years or even decades to really understand what the trends are. That's a little bit of what's starting to bubble up in our research agenda. How do we do some of the immediate components informing navigating a complex market? But also, how do we understand the outcomes of things that often take years? I mean, adult education is another example where it can often take a long time to see the economic advancement realization there. So it's a little bit of how we're thinking about it here.
Tameshia, do you want to add anything to that? Or,
I mean, other than being a liberal arts graduate, I'm like, there is value in that credential.
Exactly,
and that
right? Here's the history major.
Right. I would say there better be some value in it beyond like student loans. But yeah, I mean, I think it is like an evolving thing that we're wanting to understand. And I think about it in response to like this immediate moment that we're in, where you have millions of people literally either trying to figure out their next path, figure out what their next job is going to be, figure out what additional skills do they need. I think of like an immediate use case is in that kind of shorter term. And then I think we can think about the evolution of it down the road. And there might be opportunities to pilot it with folks who are frankly willing, right, to put their programs under the microscope to even do this at that larger kind of 4-year institutional level. So I agree. Of course, I agree with Steve that it is going to be an evolution to figure out like how does this fit in that like broader higher education marketplace. But in terms of back to your earlier question about what is the field, what is the response to the field, I think there is a more immediate response in the field as it relates to the short-term training programs and those shorter term credentials and certificate programs in the immediate. So that's kind of where my eye is focused, to be able, to get up and running and begin like continuing to expand it even broader.
So one more question on this, and then we'll do one more question to wrap up. But the question in my mind out of that, because Tameshia, you just talked about the short-term programs, been a big debate on Capitol Hill. You all know it better than I do, I suspect, around short-term Pell and uncertain results and outcomes. And then simultaneously, there's been some noise, maybe at last, around a College Transparency Act and getting more data between post-secondary programs and workforce outcomes nationally, or at least releasing some of the restrictions that have been in place there. How do you see EQOS fitting into those policy worlds? Would some of this render EQOS not as important, or does it become more important as we have more transparency and ways to connect this data? So Tameshia, maybe you first.
Yeah, I mean, I think it actually does become more important from a transparency perspective. I think of things like the eligible training provider list that is, the requirement under WIOA, and are there states who are willing, right? Because it's about like the voluntary, receptibility of institutions and organizations, right, and systems for that matter. But are there states who once they have a better understanding of EQOS and how it works, who might be willing to put their ETPL lists right through the framework and see kind of what rises and what stands, and how do they make that information then more transparent, right, to local workforce boards, to individuals who walk through the doors of American Job Centers. I mean, I think there is a broader like kind of public system opportunity and conversation that then, of course, then translates to that. But I think it is important, particularly as you're looking at long-term Pell, like what is the quality standard within that, and could EQOS be a piece of that or a testing ground for seeing that? So I do think that there is an opportunity to add this into part of the policy conversations as a solution from a policy and system perspective, to be able to solve like the question of what is actually working and what actually is resulting in good outcomes for learners and participants in programs.
Makes a lot of sense, Steve. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll build on that really quickly. I mean, thinking about the relevance of EQOS, does it make it sort of moot or more relevant? And in my own point of view is that it becomes more relevant. So, it's a data rich field, but information poor is kind of the way to think about it. And EQOS can help organize that data, advise states, institutions, state workforce agencies, regions, as they make this information available. Being able to say, hey, it's not just the data coming out of providers that's important. It must be cross-referenced with demand data. It must have deeper understanding of the value of these credentials, because while two credentials may seem very similar, if there's a demand signal that one is more preferred, gives you a better opportunity professionally, those are the types of information that must be cross-referenced as we implement hopefully some of this legislation. It's absolutely essential to do this work well.
It's interesting hearing you say that also, because I love the dynamic nature of what you're thinking about, right? In terms of responding to local conditions. It's always felt to me that sometimes policymakers want to set a bar, if you will, of it's either good or bad if it's above this. And yet, if we're in a really flush economy, placement rates for all programs might be rising above that minimum bar, but we'd still want to know where the better programs are, right? In that context, to help people find those programs and lift those programs up. So I think that actually brings me into the place where I want to wrap up with both of you, which is focused on equity. And Steve, start with you, but then Tameshia, I'd love you to jump in right afterwards, which is, we've alluded to it a couple times during this conversation, but specifically, how do you see the EQOS acquisition helping JFF drive greater equity in post-secondary education and training?
It's perhaps the most important component of some of the work that we are embarking on here with EQOS. So I talked a little bit about some of the mechanics of updating the framework and so forth to be more explicit about how we describe whether this is sort of an equitable program, equitable pathway, and so forth. We have our racial economic equity work that is here at JFF. We have a large report coming out very soon, led by Michael Collins and his team, which describes how different populations of folks have totally different opportunities based on their access to different kinds of pathways, whether they're tech or other in-demand pathways. And so I think being able to be very explicit about what type of information must be collected to be able to adequately evaluate the equity of one program or pathway over another, as well as going back to some of what we were talking about in terms of making this information available to as wide a range of individuals as possible through the platforms, through state agencies, through other ways to interact with the information. So I think that, for EQOS, it really needs to become the heart of how we are recommending the evaluation of this work. And it's not easy to do. We were on, a call with a very large tech platform not long ago. They do not collect information on demographic for probably good reasons, but it also makes it incredibly difficult to understand the efficacy at that level. So I think we will build on that from a technical perspective within the framework and the work itself. And it's JFF's leadership in these areas that we will use to inform the framework moving forward. Tameshia, I wonder if you have any.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that you can have a conversation or like a standard or a framework about quality if it isn't grounded and willing, right, to take a look at data through the lens of race and gender and and other levels of demographics. And so I see the application of EQOS connecting back to racial equity by in that kind of dynamism of the framework in terms of what you add on to. And I think part of what we would hope to add on to it is the information about participant demographic information. You cannot understand, right, how quality impacts different communities if you don't have an ability to disaggregate the data. Right. And so as much as we are able to build on EQOS with that as another element in what goes into in what programs and providers put in, that is what will be able to make it be applicable and be able to understand how quality is experienced by people, how is it experienced by Black people, how is it experienced by people who Latinx people, how is it experienced by women. Like, you have to get the data in there to be able to do it. It's not going to happen without that. But as I look at this and the potential of it, that's a piece of it.
Yeah, I think that's a tremendous set of points. And to me, it sometimes feels like No Child Left Behind era sort of conversation from the K-12 world. But I think that subgroup information is incredibly important to get that holistic picture, and also make sure, frankly, that these standards aren't used in a way, and I said it earlier, but I'll say it again, to incentivize the skimming or creaming, right, of students, just in an effort to goose their results. And it's a key reason, I think, why we want to understand both the subgroup information, but also why are students coming to a particular program? Like, what is their circumstances and their motivations, so that we can really put these things together and make sure that learners can find the right program for their situation that's most likely to result in success. So I think what you all are saying brings this together incredibly nicely. And I'll just say thank you to you both. I'm tremendously personally excited to see EQOS find a home in the JFF family, if you will. And Steve, Tameshia.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed the discussion there. And thanks so much for everybody who's been posting some questions in the chat. We've gotten a couple others through other channels that we might layer in here as well. And please continue dropping questions in. We'll be here for the next 15, 20 minutes or so, answering questions right up till 2 o'clock with us all. So to dive into a couple of questions here, we got two that are overlapping or sort of similar. So the first question is, what differentiates the EQOS framework from other quality frameworks? And then related, we got a question about quality matters in EQOS and about which stakeholders on campus manage what and when. And we thought that we might sort of tie those together. Gab, I wonder if I could ask you to start, diving in first about what differentiates the EQOS framework from others and how it intersects with things like quality matters.
Yeah, absolutely. So first I'll say what differentiates the EQOS framework from other frameworks is its comprehensiveness. We tried to build the EQOS framework really robustly around applicability to the largest number of programs. So we designed our framework to apply both to colleges and universities, traditional higher education, as well as alternative programs like skills or training programs and software development boot camps and so on and so forth. So I think the metrics and actual measures of quality themselves are so applicable that's a huge differentiator. Other than that, I think especially with the acquisition with JFF, I think what really differentiates, or what's going to differentiate us, is going to be the fact that we are trying to marry the EQOS framework with practical tools and products that will make the framework actually utilizable and actionable in real settings.
Yeah, thanks, Gab. Just to build on that, sort of that idea of the practical use of the framework, thinking about some of the partnerships, and we'll come back to some of this as well, building on some of our state pilot work, some of the work we've done over the last 2 years, and really having some of this work land on campuses where we are understanding the efficacy of programs based on outcomes, bridging into state data systems and pilot settings and so forth. So hopefully that gets at some of the center of those questions. I'm going to move on to questions, and we're available to continue discussing as well. So please do reach out via LinkedIn or email to continue discussing if you're interested. The second question is, to what degree does EQOS take into account questions of diversity, equity, and inclusion in evaluated programs? And so maybe I'll kick this one off, and Gab, hand over to you to talk a little bit about the specifics. So the way that I'll start talking about this is the EQOS framework accounts for DEI within our framework. One of the things that is important for JFF is that equity is a through line of all of our work. It's foundational. I think the team is set to drop a link to a recent market scan focused on tech providers from our racial economic equity team, focused on sort of purpose-built solutions. The point that I'm trying to make is that one of the things we want to do here at JFF is be more explicit about equity within the framework. So the framework, has, as you heard in the presentation, learning, completion, placement, earning, satisfaction is the 5 areas. On our roadmap is to upgrade or update the framework. It's excellent in its current form, and we believe there's always opportunity to continue improving. And one of those ways is to draw out the ways that we're talking about, including diversity, equity, inclusion into its own category, and enhance that through some of the work here at JFF. And Gab, maybe with that, I'll hand over to you what that will look like. But in simplest terms, it's just having a heading, equity, and then some of the technical below that.
Yeah, and that was super helpful, Steve. And I'll just echo that in the framework already we have guidelines on how to disaggregate, or sort of different metrics that should be disaggregated by diversity metrics, including race, ethnicity, gender, age, prior educational attainment, so on and so forth. But in the equity metric, we really want to build out sort of codified guide to disaggregating and to finding that data in a reliable and consistent way. And on top of that, we want to add other elements such as access to financing options. Does the school provide, routes or access points to, reliable financing options? In addition, we're looking at career services. What's the career services at any given program? Are they robust, and do they help students find those career pathways that are going to lead to equitable economic advancement? So those are just 2 examples. And, as Steve mentioned, we're trying to establish a system whereby we can continually refine and upgrade the framework. And so, as industry needs change, and as, the discourse, in post-secondary and higher ed changes, we want to be able to be adaptable and to respond to those needs.
Thanks, Gab. The next question is, can the panelists draw a through line between the framework research to how it is applied in practice, and a specific case example of a deliverable on an actual campus? So one of the things that maybe we'll tee this up, Gab, could you talk a little bit about the state pilot work to date? And then maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the new partnerships that we're developing and how this work will evolve.
Sure. So one of our main activities at EQOS to date has been our state pilot program. We've conducted 3 state pilots in Colorado, Indiana, and New Jersey to work with a set of providers in all 3 of those states to, one, just do a landscape analysis and sort of just see what the state of the field is, what's the state of play, how feasible is it for providers to collect outcomes data on their students and report it back to the state for a variety of reasons. And so we've worked with institutions from traditional higher ed, college and universities, and like I said before, to alternative skills or training programs and software development boot camps. And so some of the departments we've worked with have been Department of Higher Education, Department of Workforce Development, the Office of the Secretary of Higher Education. And so those are the main agencies that we work with. In terms of how it manifests on campus, and Steve, I know you're going to answer this question, but the way it manifests on campus would be, using the EQOS framework, it would enable any given provider to improve their systems around data collection such that they can more reliably report that information back to the state, and that would make them potentially eligible for WIOA funding through the ETPL or eligible training provider list. So that's just one way it would manifest in a college campus or in sort of any program. But on top of that, every school has different needs and purposes and potential use cases for outcomes data. And so, different departments like career services, or we worked with one for the Office of Research and Assessment in one of our schools. So, there's a lot of potential use cases on campus for this outcomes data. And so we're just trying to help everyone, improve their ability to actually get it in the first place.
Yeah, and to build on that a little bit is this is where we're driving forward with some of our new partnerships. So being able to partner with organizations that are piloting new credentials, new models of learning with throughout community colleges, for example, some other institutions as well, and working with them to apply the EQOS framework in practical ways for collecting data from those programs. We'll be making some announcements on some of those partnerships soon, and some of how that works. But know that our focus here is to evolve the framework, as we were talking about. Equity is absolutely essential as part of how we're enhancing the framework. We also have a point of view around the direction for the framework, that the framework must evolve as the world of learning evolves. So thinking about how financing options might layer in to understanding the quality of a program. Are there options to students to pay for those programs that would help them persist and complete, for example, connection to job capabilities and so forth. So in addition to equity financing, really thinking about how we might layer in understanding of program design and the components of those programs, whether it's special technology that might be required, and are some of the institutions helping people get access to it. We're working in partnership. This is one of the reasons that JFF wanted to bring EQOS here, is to partner with, as we talked about in the discussion, our research team, policy, and other teams, racial economic equity here at JFF, to really grow and enhance that framework while pairing it with some of these practical tools and testing those out. I'll pair this with, we got sort of a comment. It's not exactly a question, but there was somebody mentioned that it would be terrific to pair this with tools such as Tableau to provide access to info with large databases and so forth. And that's exactly the kind of practical tool that we are envisioning here. Teams here at JFF are working to evolve what's offered from EQOS. So I wanted to move on to another couple of questions here. I wonder if, Gab, you might be able to talk a little bit about, I'll sort of ask you to start, the role of state and federal policy in our work with EQOS. Like, what are we seeing in the policy world? How is that influencing our work? And what do we think is needed around that, I think, is what that question's getting at a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So like I mentioned before, we have our state pilot program. And so part of that is supplying the state agencies or different stakeholders with recommendations on, one, how to go about improving processes around data collection and around data reporting to state agencies from providers. We're also looking at what sorts of legislation, sort of regulatory changes would incentivize providers to collect the data in the first place and also enable them to do so at all. And so we see different pieces of legislation or different ideas percolating within different states to try and get at this work. We recently had a conversation with a state agency in Florida that just passed a regulation that is trying to do just that, to basically set the regulatory environment such that education providers of all types, from colleges and universities to the short-term accelerated programs, so everyone will be able to reliably collect outcomes data for, like I mentioned before, a variety of different reasons. So there's that. The other thing I'll mention too, and I know Steve, you have some to add to this, but WIOA, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, is actually coming up for a revote in Congress. And so JFF does a lot of work around encouraging different innovations within that law to further incentivize and enable training providers and education providers of all types to be able to collect the outcomes data they need in order to get on the eligible training provider list, which opens them up to a whole world of funding and financing opportunities. So Steve, I'll kick it back to you.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, and I was actually reading through some of the questions, so I didn't hear everything that you had mentioned, but one of the other policy pieces that we're following here is something called the College Transparency Act. We mentioned that in the discussion. It's been included in a House Competes bill. We're watching that. We think that policies like that, which require certain types of reporting and aggregation of data at the state level, federal level, is incredibly important to this work, because oftentimes the challenge with using frameworks like this is, where is the data to do this analysis? Even if you have access to the data, it is often incomplete and noisy and not great. Some of the work that we're doing is to think about how we can be a bridge between the data that providers have access to reasonably so, and then bridging into systems that might be able to understand longitudinally what the outcomes are from an employment perspective. So a little bit about how we're thinking about policy writ large here. Let me pull up another question or two as we look through. Gab, I'm going to put you on the spot with
Sure.
a question here, if that's okay.
No problem.
A few references. This is a good question from Chicagoland Career Pathways. Few references to avoiding promoting creaming or skimming. So the idea here would be that our quality seems better because we're taking candidates with sort of a particular set of experiences that make them more likely to be successful, but we're blocking other folks from these programs simply because we're worried about supports that might be needed in that type of a situation. So in what ways does the EQOS framework already account for that phenomenon? How do we advise people against sort of trying to spark their quality
Sure.
by only having folks who already have a bachelor's degree, for example,
Right.
something like that, as students? Can you talk about that a little bit, and then I can build on that as well?
Yeah, sure. So I'd say that the EQOS framework accounts for that in its emphasis on student outcomes and on its emphasis on transparency. I think part of what the EQOS framework is trying to do, both in itself as a guideline, but also sort of its place within the post-secondary and workforce development sectors, is to encourage transparency across the industry. And we believe that transparency fosters accountability. And so we believe that if any given training provider or any higher education provider were to supply the state agency or just to report publicly their outcomes on students, we'd be able to really see what the nature of their student body is. And so if they are skimming or creaming the top, so they're only taking in students who have bachelor's degrees, which would set them up for success down the road, you would be able to see that, and that would impact our quality evaluation, sort of other stakeholders' quality evaluation of them. And on top of that, the EQOS framework, we're also, like Steve and I mentioned before, we're trying to apply this to financing options, and other systems to enable disadvantaged or underrepresented folks to get into these programs, to allow them to, attain that upward mobility that we all want in society. And so I think applying our outcomes framework and sort of our push towards transparency and accountability, is just gonna, I think, we're really trying to change the culture in this industry, and make it such that, your outcomes really mean something, and we can make decisions based on that. So Steve, I'll kick it back to you.
Sure, and some of this is to build, Gab, on your comments. Some of this is about how we're evolving the EQOS framework and how it is used. So one of the things that we want to be able to do is help people navigate an increasingly complex marketplace of new learning models and so forth. We were just at South by Southwest EDU, and had a session on the metaverse, for example, and how institutions of higher education are leveraging new types of technology to increase access and so forth. And so being able to understand that articulating quality is not the same for every student. It's not the same for every person who's looking for a particular opportunity. And so being able to think about quality measures and metrics in context of an industry, within a region, for an individual, I think is a bit of what our research agenda is going to be focused on. So some of those innovations for the framework may not be incorporated immediately, because they're super complex problems that I'm sure many of the listeners know today. But know that it is on our roadmap for being able to move the industry forward in terms of how Gab was talking about it. With that, I can see we're coming up on time. We have one last perfect question, I think, to end our session on, maybe, and that's how to get in touch with the EQOS team. I think the JFF team is dropping both my and Gab's email into the chat. You can also find us on LinkedIn and reach us there. The EQOS website, eqos.org, which was also shared, has a contact form there, and messages go to Gab directly there. So really appreciate, Gab, your help on answering some of these questions. Terrific questions today. Thank you to the JFF team for helping us produce today's session, and thank you, Michael and Tameshia, for the conversation. I hope everybody enjoyed the session, and we look forward to continuing conversations with all of you out there. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Take care.